Welcome everybody to the 43rd episode of the JewishDrinking.com podcast and video show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm very excited because Rosh HaShanah is just around the corner. It's coming up next week, and we often talk about during this time apples and honey. Now, we're not talking about apples during this episode, although if you're curious, you can check out the apple cider episode with Talia Haken of Haken Family Cider. But we're actually going to be talking about honey. We're going to be talking about honey and then also converting that honey into mead. So I'm very excited to welcome guests Rabbanit Amalia Haas as well as Eli Silins. So Rabbanit Haas is going to talk about the honey process and Eli Silins is going to talk about the mead making process. So
and I am stoked to have today our guest Rabbanit Amalia Haas. Hello.
Hello. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And for those less familiar with Rabbanit Haas here, let me just do a quick bio, which is that she is an alumna of Yeshiva Maharat. She's also an alumna of Oberlin College, having studied music in the great state of Ohio. She also has a master's in Jewish education from the Azrieli School of Education at Yeshiva University. She did some studying at Pardes. She also is she's been very involved in the Jewish environmental justice movement, including having been involved with Hazon over the years, as well as being part of the Jewish Farmers Network. And at the moment, she is training in chaplaincy back here in the great state of Ohio. And this is what brings us to our present topic, which is that she is the foundress of Be Awesome, which is an educational social venture and honey company. So as we're gearing up for Rosh HaShanah, apples and honey are on people's minds. And so we're going to focus on the honey aspect, which doesn't come out of nowhere. It has to get made by bees, right?
Right. And if anybody is wanting to order honey for the fall season or for Rosh Hashanah, you can actually find it on my site, which is mkt.com/honeybeejewish.
So we're talking, in the run-up as we're getting ready for Rosh Hashanah, honey is on, at least my mind. I'm thinking very much about honey, especially for fermenting it. So we have mead, and just as a little bit of a contextual framing, for Rosh Hashanah, people often put together apples and honey. Of course, here at Jewish Drinking, you can also ferment both apples and honey, and especially thinking about throughout the Jewish literature throughout time, certainly for centuries, people have been writing about mead davash, about basically, it's cute because they call it honey water, but really we're talking mead. But I'm curious because you deal with it in its, well, I'll just call it the pre-fermented stage of its existence. And so what's, just on a, just to start with, like, what's it like working with honey? Do you work with it in like its raw state, or do you at which stages do you deal and process honey?
So I am a beekeeper. And as you're speaking, what I'm thinking about is beekeeping meetings where people will talk about the smell of that batch of honey. And what they're talking about is basically there's a quite extensive process that happens between the creation of floral nectar, which is something that the flowers do, right? It's floral nectar. And, there are certain flowers where you can grab the flower and gently tug it out and then take the end of it that's sort of straw-like, the bottom part that was embedded, and then you can sip the nectar. And it's mostly water, but you can just taste that tiny little bit of sweetness, right? Yeah. But it's mostly water, okay? And if you contrast that with like the taste of honey, which is absolutely unmissably sweet, right? There's many variations in that sweetness, but it is very sweet. So how does it happen that intensely sweet product is made from something that's much more mildly sweet, almost entirely water, right? So basically what happens is the bees collect this sweet water from the flowers, and they bring it back to the hive. Now, in a honeybee's body, there are actually two tracts. There's one tract which is, you know, in and out, like it's going through their digestive tract.
Mhm.
And then there's another which is simply a honey sac. And I like to think of it as like they don't have a backpack, so they made an interior backpack. But this is literally for carrying the liquid of the flowers back to the hive with the express intention of depositing it in the hive for the purposes of um, ripening it into honey. Now, the inner backpack honey sac in the honeybees actually has some enzymes in it that start that ripening process. Then when they bring it back to the hive, and that the bee that's bringing it back is a forager bee. These are all female worker bees. And although they fly into the hive, they actually turn right back around and fly back out. They are doing the back and forth, back and forth. They're giving it to a house bee. And the house bees are also worker bees, but they basically don't leave. They stay in-house. And without getting too deeply into bee biology, what's interesting about the worker bees is that the first half of a bee's life is spent inside the hive doing all sorts of different jobs. And I have a lot of fun teaching kids, actually. I do a program called Beehive Your Classroom. And part of that is having them act out like the multitude of different activities that worker bees do inside the hive, in contrast to what happens outside the hive, which is back and forth, this foraging activity. So the nectar is passed off, and then what has to happen is to get it from that majority water state to an 18% water state, at which point it's honey. So that takes a lot of evaporating. And it's interesting. People have a lot of different sort of stereotypical ideas of what bees are. But just to ask you, Drew, like, what's your main association with what a bee does?
I don't know, flying about or acquiring whatever stuff from the flowers themselves. But I don't know what goes on between the flower and the honey.
And the honey, right. Okay, right. So most people would not say that honeys are heating and cooling professionals. But much of what they do is actually AC work. Because they have to get the humidity out of that nectar so that it can become honey. And they also need to moderate the temperature in the hive overall so that it's just the right temperature for raising brood, which is right around 90 degrees. So you'll see these bees like outside the hive lined up, fanning like this, a whole bunch of them. And they're just standing there creating a breeze to move air over those combs of not yet honey, ripening honey, which you can't see outside the hive, but they know it's right there. And that's, and if you ever have the chance to visit a beehive, like in the summer on a warm day, just stand like down from the breeze, and you can actually smell. It's one of the most incredible experiences, just to smell the honey as it's ripening. You can smell it on the breeze. Sometimes when you're a beekeeper and it's time to harvest the crop, you'll have a frame of honey. I wish I had one here to show you. You'll have a frame of honey, and much of it is sealed up, which means that the bees have decided, and they know, believe me, that this is now honey. But there's a part of it that's not yet sealed up. And what that means is there's still too much water in that honey, in that in that ripening honey, and it's not time yet. But a beekeeper will be like, but it's mostly done. So I think I just want to take it out of the comb. I just want to extract that honey, and they'll extract the whole thing. Now, if there's just a little bit too much water and just a small amount of that frame, you're okay. It's still going to stay honey. Mm-hmm. But if there's really too much water, it's going to become fermented. And you're going to open your bucket of honey, and you're going to be like, woo, woo, that smell. Nice. It's really interesting because, like, when it gets to 18% moisture, it will last indefinitely as long as it's not exposed to too much water.
When it's in when it starts that fermentation, is it drinkable or edible?
Not in my experience. It's
okay.
It turns and it's not.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I haven't gone around like tasting that, and fortunately, I guess I'm blessed that I'm patient enough that I haven't had the firsthand experience.
Yeah.
Happen with my honey.
And so when you harvest this honey, and then how do you process it? After the bees have prepared it down to this 18% level.
Right. So what happens is that they cap the comb, and in order to get the honey out of the comb, which is of course made of beeswax, right? There are two things that you can do. So in the old days, people did what was called crush and strain, which is as violent as it sounds. Like you took a piece of the comb and you just mushed it with your hands, got the honey all over your hands, and then if you let it sit, eventually the wax and the honey will separate. You can just collect the wax and use it for all sorts of different valuable things. And then you can have the honey in its liquid form. The other thing you can do is just cut the comb and spread the comb with the honey with the beeswax on your toast or whatever have you. A modern invention, which is really sort of a new thing in the last 150 years, that was invented by a pastor by the name of Langstroth, and it's Langstroth and the now very known Langstroth hive, is a really neat invention whereby and lift up and put back different sections of the hive. And you can also take the surface off the comb, take the cappings, they're called, off the comb, put it in a centrifuge and extract the honey by spinning, and then give the bees back their comb to refill, which is very helpful for them because it takes about 8 or 9 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of beeswax. So beeswax is very labor intensive. And if you can just give them back that architecture, then they don't have to remake it. They can just refill it and cap it again.
When you're extracting, or humans are extracting it, and then like, do you have to do any processing aside from what you mentioned as far as the separation of beeswax and actual honey? Is there much you have to do, or is like the honey's ready to go and it can just be saved forever?
There's not that much that you have to do. Now, it depends. It depends how you approach honey. So for me, I believe that honey is really an extraordinary, almost holy food, and that it should be as little tampered with as possible. It shouldn't be overly strained. It shouldn't be overly filtered. It certainly should not be overheated, because when you do that, you really kind of change it into something essentially as mundane as sugar water, and you start to lose the special qualities of honey. which are pretty extensive. I mean, it's antiviral, it's antimicrobial. There are all of these amazing things about honey.
I would imagine the possibility of legs and wings or other parts. How common is that?
So, when honey is sort of hyper strained and filtered, it's very, very rare to see any of that. When people are treating it as trying to keep it as much as a raw product as possible, and they're not filtering it so intensely, so then it's imaginable that there might be a wing here or there, or even a leg. What happens? What typically what happens is that when I have like a large vat of honey, I extract it and then I go away for a few days. And all of those sorts of things kind of rise to the surface, and then I can kind of skim them off. But there might be, it's possible that there's like some little bee part. What's interesting is the halachic literature seems to indicate that honey has a special capacity to change anything that's any little part like that will eventually turn into honey. So you don't have to worry about a small bee part in the honey. Now, if you can see it, you should, pick it out. But unless you have like a whole insect, which would fall into that category of Baria, honey is kosher as long as it's the real thing. Some of the halachic literature is concerned about tampering with honey, sort of funny honey. And, I don't know if you saw these exposés a few years back about the tampering with olive oil, the amount of things that are just kind of like mixed in that are cheaper, because whenever there's a product that people are willing to pay a premium for, if you can kind of like, cut it with something cheaper, then the person selling it can make more of a profit, right? So the same thing can happen with honey, where people could try to cut it with corn syrup. Halachically, we're concerned about, could people try to cut it with something not kosher, or something dairy? Could they cut it with milk? Could they, but for the most part, even if that does happen, it's not going to be a non-kosher product, but it won't be a pure honey product, which is why I recommend knowing your beekeeper. I really do.
Speaking of knowing your beekeeper, how often
have
you sold your honey to mead makers?
So I have sold a few gallons of honey to mead makers, which was kind of fun.
Yeah.
I was like, I want to have a taste. And actually, somebody did send me some mead that was made from my honey, and that was really cool. They sent it in this like really cool like glass vial, and that was just like a neat feeling. Yeah. Do you make mead?
No, I've had friends who've made mead. It takes a long time, like at least a half year. You just have to wait. I mean, beer can take a couple of weeks, 2 to 4 weeks. Mead takes like 6 to 12 plus months.
Yeah, it's an investment.
Yeah, and a lot of patience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A lot of patience.
Yeah.
And apparently, actually, one of my friends back when I lived in California, he said the honey was just so expensive. You're gonna like take a big batch, like just compared to like the same amount of grains for beer, it's a huge difference in price.
Huge difference. Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, the great thing about honey, not just for mead, but really for almost any beverage, is that it has a lot of fermentable sugars in it. So obviously, just for mead, it's great. But I've seen people throwing in honey into beer, but the other, ciders, right? So I've actually done a little bit of cider myself where I just threw in some honey and it boosted the fermentable sugars. It wasn't sweeter, unfortunately. It was just boozier because
Oh, really?
the sugars from the honey like were high, like fermented mostly out almost entirely.
Uh-huh.
Very little of the
Uh-huh.
sugars remained from that honey. So yeah.
So it doesn't taste so sweet, is what you're saying, but it's got more of an alcohol kick to it.
Yeah, so I did last year at some point. It was like super. It was something that like a college kid could do. Okay, so I went to Trader Joe's. I bought some apple juice, pasteurized apple juice, and
Okay.
then I did two different things. I bought pasteurized apple juice, and I bought pasteurized apple juice, and then honey, also from Trader
Okay.
Joe's. And then I went got some cider yeast, and then put a little an air exchange thing in both. I drilled holes in both of them and put in the yeast. And the one that had just the apple juice was nice. It was some nice little cider. Like the one with honey, like that, it added some like nice body to it, increased the booze level. Not so much the sugars though. Like
Huh.
because the honey, like it just for like the sugars and honey just ferment out. Really incredible.
Hmm.
And I think that's the real shocker. I think for people who've never had mead before or don't know what to expect, it's not this sweet. I mean, it's not this sweet beverage that one would imagine. Like honey's a sweet item. You'd think mead is also sweet, and yet the sugars just ferment out. Of course, you could ferment honey, and then when you're done fermenting, you throw more honey in, so you get
Okay.
some sweetness.
Right.
Otherwise, the sugars ferment out, and you get a high amount of booze, which is delicious. It's just not the sweet beverage one would expect.
There was a discovery that in Beit Sha'an, right in the center of ancient Beit Sha'an, they found 2,000 hives. Like it was very clear that there was not just a small amount of honey production going on in the land of Israel, but like this was big business. That was very, very interesting, that discovery, archaeological discovery in Beit Shan. The Bible talks about, honey from the crag of the rock, which that's definitely a reference to bee honey. But then there are many people say that the honey that's referred to in the Torah is actually date honey. It's clearly both, but it was just sort of exciting for those of us who actually keep bees to see, oh, well, among, other things, there clearly was a lot of honey production going on in the land of Israel.
Wow. Although I do want to mention, speaking of the land of Israel and honey, that when it comes to the 7 species of the land of Israel, that 6 of them are fermentable into alcohol.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the only one that as far as I know, unless someone out there does know, is Shemen Zait, that you can't really take olive oil and ferment it. But the other 6, you can make beer and wine and mead. You can do lots of things.
Oh,
with the other 6 species.
Tell me about Rimonim, about pomegranate.
I've had pomegranate liqueur. It's delicious.
Wow, that sounds
in Israel. You can probably get it in America too, but definitely in Israel they sell it.
Definitely in Israel.
Yeah, pomegranate liqueur, especially if this is like the simplest cocktails to put pomegranate liqueur with vodka and you're good to go. But I'm sure there's some actual clever concoctions someone can make with pomegranate liqueur. Yeah, you got the grains, you've got the grapes. So between the grains and the grapes, you got wine and beer right there.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
I just don't know. I don't know what to do with the olive, although I'm sure someone out there is saying, use it as a garnish. Use it as a garnish.
Right. That's great. Huh.
Yeah. Thank you for that insight. I didn't, it's funny because usually when I think of the honey, I know everybody points to and says, the dvash, the honey, when we talk about the 7 species of the land of Israel, it's not bee honey. We're talking about date honey. But it's fascinating that it could also potentially be honey as well. All right. Well, Rabbanit Amalia Haas, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It was really great having you and learning lots about bees.
It's such a pleasure being here. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
A lot of fun. I learned too.
Oh, great. Great. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again, Anne L'chaim.
Chaim.
I hope you enjoyed that segment with Rabbanit Amalia Haas. And before we move on to the segment with Eli Silins and talking about mead, I want to give you a sneak peek into next week's episode talking about drinking during the 10 days of repentance.
So maybe if you wanted to go along the lines of what Rabbi Yisraelis is saying here as far as apples and honey, could be mead, it could be an apple cider. And these are both sweet things, and these dovetail in just lovely with the custom of having sweet apples and honey.
I hope you enjoyed that clip about drinking during the 10 days of repentance. Now I'm very excited to talk with Eli Silins, who talks about mead making. Here we go.
Eli Silins from Camuna Cellers in Pennsylvania, in the Philadelphia area. So Eli is a vintner. He sells wines, but he is definitely into ciders and meads as well. And he has a license to sell those creations, those products in the state of Pennsylvania, correct, Eli?
Yeah.
Yes.
Newly,
Okay, so
newly minted.
what?
Newly minted.
Newly minted. As of the recording of this, he has a license to sell all of those aforementioned beverages in the great state of Pennsylvania. And so we're talking about mead, right? We're getting ready for Rosh Hashanah. I'm wearing a yellow shirt. That doesn't happen every day. I want to talk about honey being fermented. We could, of course, talk about your great wine products, but I'm curious to hear, I heard you had a really great mead run, right? Back before you moved to Pennsylvania, when you were still in Northern California.
Yeah.
Eli, do you want to tell us about, and look, I know you're experienced, you've got some good wine products out there, but let's talk about fermented honey for a moment. How different for you, especially as a vintner, how different is the mead making process from the wine making process?
I think that they're definitely parallel, but also totally different. Wine, you get grapes, you crush them, it turns into wine. We don't really do much. Honey is so sweet and sugary that it's very stable, and you need to do something. But basically, just add water, and that, yeah. I mean, there's other things you can do, but that's the essence. It's just honey and water.
You have to throw in some yeast, right? Unless you just leave it out and whatever yeasts are in the air, they find the sugars to make their magic happen, right?
Yeah. I mean, you could add yeast, you could add different flavorings, or herbs are traditional, fruit, but yeah. Yeast is everywhere. It's just having the amuna that the right yeast will come to you.
And of course, amuna rhymes with Camuna, right, as your cellars. How patient do you need to be for mead, though, right? Do you have to be more patient for mead than wine as far as the fermentation process?
With my mead making, it kind of just let it go. So for me, sometimes with fermentation, it's easier to forget about something for a little bit, like mead, and just make sure that it's mostly happy and not too much airspace.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also bottle it earlier, and keep some of that carbonation and kind of the ancestral method of carbonation.
What is the ancestral method?
So ancestral method, basically before it's finished fermenting all the sugar out, before it's completely dry, you bottle it, and so the carbon dioxide produced in that last little bit will be just enough to kind of make it nice and bubbly and fun.
Very neat. I didn't know if it maybe involved throwing some more honey in, adding a little bit more sweetness, a little bit more opportunity for some carbonation going on. But
all these things, there's many different ways and many different styles, and it's kind of, that's the fun part.
Yeah. Have you ever tossed in some herbs into mead before?
Yeah. So one of the most ancient recipes that I found was for a heather mead, and it called for a bunch of different things. And this is, when you get into mead, and like there are people into mead and Viking lore and all this stuff, the heather apparently has some salutary effects in conjunction with the alcohol and the mead. And when it was fermenting, I thought it was disgusting and it smelled horrible to me, and nobody wanted to drink it. And I was like, whatever, I'll figure out something to do with this. And then when it was done and bottled, it was delicious. Yeah.
What else
So
aside from heather did you put into it?
sorry.
Aside from heather, what else did you put into it?
That was it. Basically, I made a heather tea and then used that to mix in the honey.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So, some
And
nice
nothing
earthiness to it, earthy herbality.
Hmm?
Some earthy herbality in addition to whatever honey was going on.
So there's different, supposedly mead is some of the oldest alcoholic beverages around.
Mm-hmm.
And they have different styles and different ways. I think I'm going to botch the name. Methylglyn is mead with herbs, and it was a medicinal drink. Sizer, like I was saying, is what I think the perfect Rosh Hashanah drink. Is mead with cider mixed, so it's apples and honey for Rosh Hashanah.
That's good.
Yeah, and
yeah.
can you do a bunch of different meads, or herbs, or one or the other? And it's also, it's considered medicinal also, and delicious sometimes.
Wow. That sounds really tasty to me.
Yeah, I'm excited about that stuff.
Yeah.
Like an endless possibility of, healthy, fun medicine.
Really great. And mead, though, does take a while, right? How long does its fermentation process take compared to maybe the winemaking process? Like, how do they contrast against each other?
So I think it depends. Winemaking also, it depends what style, what kind of grapes, how long it takes.
Mm-hmm.
I think mead is similar. I've heard things, mead, the longer you let it go or the longer you age it, the better it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I don't have that much experience. I think the fermentation process is probably, from my experience, it's been a little bit slower to get dry. But that being said, once it's dry, the aging is kind of just based on the mead maker's taste and what they want to do with it. And I'm not going to claim to be an expert in that department. But I made mead, I think in 2019 that we had for Rosh Hashanah. So around, I guess, summertime. It was probably 5 months.
Just the amount of time that we've been in quarantine.
Yeah. And I should say it was still
quarantine.
Quarantine mead.
Yeah.
There's so many fun projects you can do stuck at home.
That's true. Just take some random sugars, yeast it up. Yeah.
Well, it seems everybody's been working on sourdough. It's also, it's fermentation.
Yeah, it's true.
Making friends with the yeasties.
It's true. Yeast is our friend. Eli, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And l'chaim.
Bye.
Thank you so much for watching this episode, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I want to wish you a Lashana Tova. So thank you so much, and have a happy and sweet new year. L'chaim.